So at the beginning of the talks, I generally start off by pointing out that what we talk about is something very specific. There's many ways of pointing at this, and it's not really only just pointing, but it's part of a methodology, part of a process of change. And what we speak about in practical terms is happiness for the human being in daily living. And if we're really honest, if we have the good fortune of our attention really coming into the present moment and becoming more and more familiar with our life experience, we will at some point come to the first-hand realization, actually all I'm really looking for, when I go past all of the theories, past all of the concepts that I might have taken on, what I'm really craving is for happiness. But it's very important that we define this happiness correctly. So the realization is that actually I'm looking for the happiness that isn't happiness in the form of outcomes. We've all received outcomes. They're nice while they're there, and then they fade away. And even when we get the most intense pleasure, when we get that which we are craving the most in a circumstantial form, so we might get the best job promotion, we might find the perfect partner, and we find in practice that that doesn't actually deliver ongoing happiness. And so once we've realized that isn't a happiness that is available on a continuous, unbroken basis, the flow of life is pleasure sometimes and pain at others, and that receiving pleasure doesn't give me a consistent happiness. When we realize that the happiness that is available on a consistent basis is happiness through peace of mind, and that peace of mind in practical terms just means the absence, the falling away, the end of something. When we look at it, we see that actually it's the end of an uncomfortable relationship with oneself, an uncomfortable relationship to the other. When I say relationship, it sort of means attitude towards oneself. So the end of an uncomfortable attitude towards oneself, and the end of an uncomfortable attitude towards the other. The end of an uncomfortable attitude towards the ever-changing circumstance in life. So in practical terms, what we're really looking for is the end of something. And I'd hazard a guess at saying that everyone in here has their own experience. That if the working mind, the intellect, the honed intellect, the wisdom side of the intellect, if that is directed to look, we'll confirm this for ourselves. That yes, I've had those periods where I can put my hand on my heart and say, in this moment I'm happy. And if we find that we can say this in a moment when our circumstance isn't particularly different from what it generally is, we'll realize that, actually I can say I'm happy because there's the absence of unhappiness. That's really when I can say I'm happy, when that unhappiness that is sometimes regularly there, depending on different people, when that's fallen away. And so it's very important for us to start really looking at our experience so that we can come to an understanding of what it is we're really looking for, what it is that's really available, not just through concepts that we take on and believe, but from our own investigation. And so on the converse of this, the converse being when I can say I'm happy in a particular moment, I can look and see and say, actually I'm happy not because circumstance is particularly different from normal, but because there's nothing disturbing the experience. So we could say that my natural state is peace of mind when there isn't a disturbance. So we come to know what happiness is, And then in those moments when we can put our hand on our heart and say, in this moment I'm not happy, from experience. And when we look at it, and when we see, so what is it that's happening in this moment when I can put my hand on my heart and firmly say, I am not happy in this moment. And the suggestion is, if we look closely, if we're interested without judgment and just curious to know what our unhappiness is, we'll find that in general terms it's an uncomfortableness with oneself or the other, or an uncomfortableness with life. And when we look at it more closely, we'll find it arises in different forms, like guilt, which is an uncomfortableness with oneself, blame, and uncomfortableness with the other, pride, which is another form of uncomfortableness, less intense than the other two I've mentioned, or attachment to outcomes, wanting life to be a certain way, expecting life in the future to look a certain way, and all worry and anxiety. So there's all of these different forms of uncomfortableness with oneself and with life. And then when we look even closer at these different forms, we find that at first it seems like the problem is circumstance. Like the problem is that the fact the other didn't do what I would like them to have done, or that my actions led to a bad outcome, and I think that that's the problem, that there was a bad outcome, that the other didn't function. When we look more closely, we see actually the uncomfortableness is not the circumstance itself, but rather our attitude to the circumstance, how we're interpreting what has happened. And what we find is, if a change happens such that our attitude to the circumstance is not an attitude of resistance, basically a deep understanding that circumstance is going to be what it's going to be, then we find, wow, my uncomfortableness, my unhappiness isn't circumstantial. It's attitudinal. And that when the attitude of resistance falls away, we're connected to ourself on a continuous basis. We know ourself in a way independent of circumstance. We're never really independent of circumstance. It all arises together. But we find that there is an equanimity, which means a peace, a connection to oneself independent of circumstance. And life's always giving us opportunity to see this. So for the the working mind to become conditioned in a way that allows us to start seeing our landscape more clearly, our inner landscape in particular more clearly, especially relative to this topic of what are we really looking for, relative to this topic of human happiness, then to the extent that the working mind becomes conditioned to see this, we start to see dynamics that maybe weren't seen before. Both those that are described as in line with actuality, and those attitudinal dynamics that are out of line with the working of actuality. And as we see those movements of mind that essentially are a story about life based on a interpretation of the functioning, we start to see, oh look, this is the error. This is the illusion that we have about life. And as that illusion, that false belief, is seen in action, then that itself is the beginning of the dissolving of that. So what is the false belief that turns into the resistance to life? Because at the end of the day, what I'm suggesting is that human happiness is available. The human happiness that's available is happiness through peace of mind. Peace of mind is the absence of suffering, the falling away, the non-arising of suffering. And that suffering is always attitudinal and not circumstantial. And that the attitude that leads to suffering is based on a false belief of who we are and what life is, which is really good news. A false belief of who we are and what life is. That's why suffering can come to an end, because it simply requires the false belief to be understood to be false. It requires the false belief to be seen to be inaccurate, telling a false story. And it's only then that the momentum, the power that that belief has contained within it, starts to be extracted out of it, and it atrophies. For as long as that movement is allowed to continue and seen as accurate, it doesn't atrophy. So what is the belief at the core of the attitude that results in suffering? And suffering in practical terms: guilt, blame, and pride. Let's look at the first half. So the core of the belief at the base that enables this attitude of uncomfortableness in the form of guilt, blame, and pride to arise is the belief that I and everyone else are separate, independent entities in control of everything that happens through us, including and especially our thinking, our feeling, our emotions, and our actions. Now, what I mean by a belief is when we think, when we act, when we speak, we interpret that, we see it as me doing all of that. And the me that we see, that we imagine doing it all, is a me that actually doesn't exist. A me that is imagined to be separate and independent from the rest of life. Autonomous is one of the words we could use in the English language. Autonomous means insulated, independent, self-existing. right? So then we have this idea of ourself, this self-image of who we are that really doesn't exist. So a false self-idea. And that false self-idea has a great power. It has a power to obstruct our true self. And our true self is not in opposition to however life arises. So it doesn't fight the false belief. It remains in the background, allowing that to be part of life. While that is part of life, the experience the human has is one of uncomfortableness, because that false belief of who we are has to feel uncomfortable with life. Because firstly, if we believe ourselves to be different from what we actually are, we're bound to have to miss out on the comfortableness of knowing ourselves. So we're forced to feel uncomfortable because of a disconnection from ourselves. And the second part of the false belief of who we are is that we believe ourselves to be an entity that requires things to happen in the future, basically pleasure and circumstance, to happen a certain way in order for me to be complete. And so with that idea of ourselves, we're forced to continually seek outward, to continually try to control the uncontrollable, continually expecting life to look a particular way. We're invested in that because it's become part of our identity, part of who we believe we are, and therefore what we think we need to be complete, and therefore where all our attention and effort is going to go. Now, these deeply ingrained beliefs can be seen to be there by us observing the movements and reactions we have to life. So if the working mind has become conditioned to, at least intellectually at first, understand that at least the description that's being given is there is this false identity in place. And that the way that we can confirm this false identity being there, or at least this identity being there, is to see the way we react to life, the way we function in life. We just need to look at our movement towards pleasure, pleasure, pleasure in the future. We just need to see our attitudinal resistance when life doesn't turn out in line with our preferences. And this will start to give us irrefutable evidence that says, based on an observation of my thought systems, my thought patterns, I must have this belief about who I am. An example is when an internal psychological resistance to life being not our ideal. So when life turns out to deliver pain rather than pleasure, and this resistance in the form of blaming the other for it, this resistance in insisting it shouldn't be like this. Something has gone fundamentally wrong for life to have delivered this pain to me. If we see this, we say, wow, there must be this belief system in place. Because otherwise, where would this movement be coming from? So essentially, this identity is saying what I am is a separate independent entity, and I need all of these things in life in order to be complete. And we've been told by many, many spiritual traditions that we've forgotten who we are, that we've become hypnotized, identified sometimes is the word that is used, identified with what we're not. And that forgetting, be ready to fight the monkeys. That forgetting leads to an uncomfortableness, and that liberation comes from knowing oneself, remembering oneself. So I'm just putting it into maybe more practical terms. So not better, because actually practical is not always what is needed. But if we can start to see that these things are pointed at from different angles, but they're really pointing at the same thing, and if we can come to understand, oh wow, is that what that teaching was talking about? It's talking about something practical. And we've forgotten ourselves because we've come to believe ourselves to be something that we're not. And how is it that we've come to believe this? It's not of our own doing. The belief was put in place because the principle being put forward is we've come to believe ourselves to be the doer, to be a separate independent entity that is responsible for how we turn out, is responsible for how life turns out. And so when this belief is in place and we hear that there is an error in place, a false idea, the belief automatically says, oh, I must have done that. The suggestion, the concept that's being put forward is we are not the doers. That is one of the realizations that allows us to connect back into ourselves. We are part of life, never separate from the amazing unfolding of life, which is much, much bigger than just you or I and just my life and just your life. It's like a big wave of evolution, you could say, and we're always at the cusp of that wave, which is turning into the next moment. And the cusp of the wave is a result of everything that came before. Innumerable factors that we can never know. We don't know everything that has come before, but we can see that what is here now is a result of everything before. So our beliefs that are in place are not our doing. They're a result of life. Life has put them in place. This is the principle of non-doership, to see that what is in place is in place. We could say it is in what I am, the human being, but then we also see it, but what I am is not my doing. I didn't create myself. I am a result of life up to this point in time. And at each moment, life is delivering new conditioning as part of the unfolding of life, and I'm changing. And so the change is not my doing. The change is just part of the unfolding. Can you pass the microphone back?
Roger, often when this openness, life changing all the time. So some moments of openness and some moments of clarity. When it's in the error, this why always arises, but why? Happens often that when I'm able to see that that everything is perfect, that there's no wrongness and all that, then there's no wrongness, and why the error? Like why all this confusion? Why the illusion? Why at the same time life deliver the clarity, but why at the same time is the illusion or the confusion of happening? So I guess it's some kind of obstacle on the way, but I bump often into why, why suffering? Then it comes like,
why not?
Good, everything feels good, okay, but why others are still suffering, or
Why not?
it becomes like, why this whole thing, you know, why all the confusion for finding not clarity? You know, like, feel like the whole, you know, kind of like a futile, like why is this whole turning around?
Yes, I go, why not?
It's like a futile, like a waste of,
From whose perspective? So, let me say, from the perspective where we're attached to pleasure, the unfortunateness of life is like, we say, why? Why this? Why not pleasure? So if an understanding comes in and says, actually life is on one level duality, interconnected opposites, pleasure and pain. That is the painting, that is the masterpiece that has been created in this manifestation. Is a manifestation of interconnected opposites, duality. So it's like looking at a painting in a museum that is, I don't know the genres, but let's say, or a movie, a horror movie, and saying, why a horror movie, right? If you see it from outside and you see, well, that's a very valid creation, a very valid expression of the potentiality, a very valid form of art. It might not be someone's preference, but we can see the validity of it. And so if we come to see that this life is interconnected opposites, like, it doesn't matter what we would like, we just see this manifestation is health and disease, wealth and poverty, good and bad, male and female, big and small, hot and cold. It has to be, it's created, it's a time-space continuum of duality on the experiential level. And the duality isn't an illusion on the experiential level. If our psychological attachment falls away, we still have a biological entity, and the biological entity, without us, even if we don't label something as pleasurable or painful, the biological will still feel either pleasure or pain. So even when our misunderstanding falls away, life continues to be an experience of interconnected opposites. Sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain. So given that's the case, that even once our misunderstanding falls away, life continues to be duality on a level, then we say, this is the nature of life. And so then, hard as it might be for us to accept, the question why falls away. So if you ask me why, my answer is because life is a creation of interconnected opposites. Might not be acceptable to you, but it's the description. And as our attachment to outcomes falls away, it becomes so much more acceptable. So what that means is, once the attachment to outcomes falls away and we find that there is a peace, a comfortableness with oneself, even in the face of pleasure and pain, then the explanation that life includes atrocities because there are great acts of kindness, then that explanation becomes more and more acceptable, because we find that we know ourselves independent of outcomes, so we can remain connected and at peace, knowing ourselves at peace, even when life is going to be sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. When the attachment to outcome is there, it's much harder to accept that life is sometimes pain, because that with the attachment to outcome in place means that's an attack on myself. And so we can't accept that life is an attack on what I believe myself to be. So we don't want to accept the fact that life is always going to be pleasure and pain, and we try to imagine that we can make life pleasure, 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 pleasure. If we work hard enough, we can make life pleasure, 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 pleasure. And it isn't going to be that. But even with life being at the nature of the flow of life, sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain, the good news is when we drop out of the false idea of who we are and connect to a part of ourself that is the core of the human being, we find that peace nonetheless is available on a continuous basis, even given the explanation I've put forward of the nature of the flow of life. So next time you ask why, you can give yourself the answer, because.
Press somewhere?
If the green light is on,
hello. Okay.
You're good to go.
Hi. I kind of find myself, like this observing part or this accepting or whatever, you would want to call it, but that part that is at peace with itself, no matter what the circumstances. I sort of, know that part, and it's kind of always there. But the question is, I work very much with the inner guru, since I don't have an outer one, and I'm not really too much into searching for one either, I think. So I have the impression that sometimes the outer circumstances sort of test me. Maybe it's just my impression, but I wonder whether you would share what you think about, like cosmic testings or whatever. Because like that way I see where I'm getting stronger or where there's still work to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, because the thing that we're intuitively moving away from, which is an uncomfortableness with ourself, the arising of suffering, because that's what we're intuitively moving away from, and because our suffering is always attitudinal to circumstance, meaning where we see a circumstance and we judge it as being appropriate or inappropriate. We see the action of the other and we say, you should or you shouldn't have acted that way. So, or we have an expectation of how life should look, which is not circumstance, but our attitude to the future, let's say. So it means that it's, in a way, directly linked to circumstance. Meaning that when circumstance arises, our attitude to the circumstance is either going to deliver peace, because it will be an attitude of allowing, of not resisting, or it's going to be an attitude of resistance, one or the other. And so when circumstance is a certain way and our attitude is a certain way, what arises is suffering. And then if life has developed us enough to be able to say, well, actually what I'm moving away from, the natural movement is a movement to less suffering, a movement where suffering diminishes, then you could say that life is always, in a sense, aiding us or testing us.
Pushing.
Yes, it's pushing, yes, it's driving us, it's giving us opportunity to see past the blocks that are still allowing suffering to arise. Mm. And at some point, life tests you by, and not only tests at that point, but confirms in you that the job is done, because at some point life throws painful situations at you, and you're surprised that the situation painful, not what you would like. You miss your aeroplane, someone you love dies, someone you love betrays you or lets you down. And you're surprised that there's no resistance to that. You feel the pain, no resistance. And you think, wow, and then the next time it happens, that pain, life delivers pain, you find that there is a natural okayness with it. And you realize that the okayness is just the absence of the previously there not okayness. Right?
Yeah, but I sort of had the impression that the testing, like first they tickle you a little bit, and then they come out and sometimes punch you. Okay, and I wondered whether there is some point, like when you're fully realized being, if there is such thing as a fully realized being, or maybe there's not. Maybe we're like sort of always on the path, and this kind of thing always will happen. Mm-hmm. But I have the impression that, like first it's a little tickle, then it's a poking, and then it's like don't take this. How are you going to go with that? Do you have the impression, like, did that happen to you?
I mean, I've always said I've had a very easy life. I think I say that because luckily the suffering wasn't there, and I tend to overlook the fairly challenging circumstances that actually were there. But in experience, they didn't feel that challenging because the attitude was one that didn't arise in a very resisting way. So I used to think, actually, I can't really answer that question because I've had a very fortunate life. And I have, relative to a lot of life circumstance that you see out there. Then when I thought about it, I said, no, actually I've had I've had my fair share of fairly intense circumstance. And I look at it and I say, oh, actually there wasn't a resistance arising there. So if I speak from my experience, I would say that the change that is available is an in-principle change. And that it can be that the suffering, regardless of the intensity of the circumstance, can be completely absent. And at first, that's not going to be the case. At first, we can find ourselves at peace with the smaller challenges. But as the misunderstanding gets less and less, then we find that even when big challenges come in, the attitude remains one of quietness. And so another way of putting this is that if we find ourselves being able to be more at peace with the smaller inconveniences in life that previously we weren't, which means there's a change that, a change from resisting the small inconveniences to being at peace with the small inconveniences. So on that we'd say, well, why can't that change continue? Why can't the change that's on that trajectory of more peace continue? And so if we say, well, logically, it could continue, it could deepen, it could become more and more known, whatever it is that's known, that leads to being able to not resist. As that goes deeper and deeper, we can conclude, actually, I don't see why we can't get to a stage where we simply don't suffer. I believe that the process, see that the process doesn't have an end. The process is an ongoing process. There will always be new levels of change that happen. But as far as the suffering goes, I think that suffering can end along the greater process. There's a point where suffering ends. The process continues. But if someone says, is it your experience that suffering can end completely? I say yes, for many years.
Okay, so you just sit there and go like, oh yeah, what the fuck?
Internally, we just realize that the uncomfortableness that used to arise no longer arises.
Yeah. Okay, I feel that too. Okay.
It's a great gift.
Thank you.
A gift from life.
Well, I worked for it too.
Indeed, we find that there is a process, but when we really look at it, we say, wow, I was so lucky to be designed such that the motivation to do this work arose.
Yeah.
So even that, we can be grateful for the fact that the impetus to meditate, the impetus to read certain books, the impetus to travel to places was inserted in us, in a sense, by life. So that's the paradox, where, yes, effort needs to be made, but at some point we find that that effort happened through this body, but maybe it's not as much my effort as the thinking mind wants to claim. So we can hold on to, this is why if someone says, do I need to make any effort in this process? If it's clearly seen that someone is making effort from a personal doership standpoint, like I will get this, I will make it happen, I'm going to meditate for 3.5 hours a day starting at 6 o'clock on the dot, and I'm going to become the best meditator, then you'd say to that person, you can't make it happen. No matter how much effort you put into it, it's not going to be your doing. In fact, you as the doer are part of the problem. So allow the process to happen, understanding it takes no personal effort.
Yeah, I can sort of feel like the effort falls away more and more, and things just sort of tend to manifest.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I don't like them a lot, but I feel like I feel a sort of the effort there's not much effort anymore.
Yeah, so that's the effortless effort, where we find, wow, a lot of work is being done, let's say, and yet it feels like that's what I want to do. So when we fall into this place where we allow life to happen through us, where we realize I'm being lived, then the required effort unfolds, part of the intelligence of the body going towards places that deliver more and more food of the sort that is needed. That's just the intelligence of the body. So we find the effort is happening, but it feels very effortless.
You just said something, I'm sorry, I don't really want to, but take too much of your time, but you said something that kind of made me think that, look, I'm kind of addicted to information. And I'm just wondering whether, to what extent that is the ego or the mind that really loves to sort of twist itself around stuff and gather new informations and take more light in and more because it's so joyful, not because I feel the urge, but it's like, yeah, why not? And I wonder, like, if a fully realized being wouldn't be just happy to sit there and not move, or to what extent this ego part, or you call it the what did you call it again? The mind, the
thinking mind.
Yes, it's got to do with that.
So, let's say a fully realized, or someone. So let's be clear on what the definition here is. Someone where suffering has ended doesn't have the biological need, in a sense, to engage in certain information because that problem has been dealt with. So while that problem is still there, it's part of the working mind, not the thinking mind, part of the working mind that is seeking out that information, because the working mind knows that the information is useful at dissolving the problem. So once the problem is dissolved, the working mind no longer seeks that information. It's irrelevant. It's like, I've used the boat to get from one side of the shore to the other. When I was on that side and I needed to get that side, I needed to go around, I needed to negotiate with people to buy a boat or to teach me how to build a boat or whatever. So that was functional. And then when I get to the other side, I say, no, the boat isn't needed anymore, right? So the wisdom of the working mind says, now I don't need to engage in receiving more and more of that information. I received it, it did its job, and so now I can sit quietly.
But that sounds so boring to me. I don't know.
Yes, we imagine what, we often tend to imagine and come to a conclusion of what something that is described is going to be.
But isn't it that always new information's coming in?
Sure, for another problem, let's say, that might be needed to be addressed. And so if there is an interest in something else, we'll be interested in information. But when the suffering falls away, what we find is that a lot of the time, not all the time, because there is the flow of life too, but a lot of the time we're just happy to sit quietly. And there's no need to entertain ourselves with other activities. Now, I don't say that that is how the understanding will present all of the time, but there'll be many more. It's sort of intermittent, that there's times we're just happy to sit quietly, to drop into our being and understand the core of our humanness, not understand it intellectually, but to know it, to be it, to understand the core of our being as this mysterious emptiness. And as we drop into that, there is this self-confirming contentment.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, don't you? But I still think it's kind of going on and on and on and on and on. And from what I feel right now, it's like the information, since it's always like streaming in more and more and more information from I don't know what cosmic sources, there's always more to integrate. So, and I feel like I'm very happy to just sit and be with me and everything and everyone in this state. But then also I feel like the tide is changing and some more information is there and I need to integrate that. It's just like, I feel this is what's happening, but...
Yeah, I agree. So that's right. It doesn't become completely self-absorbance. And then the new information is information that comes, and while it's coming, it's welcomed, it's received. But there's also a wisdom and a knowing that if we find that we've lost touch with something because a part of our thinking has maybe got attached to outcomes or something like that, then in that instant, it's like stop. And we drop into being. We know we can go back to that thinking in 2 minutes or 5 minutes or a day's time or whatever. And there's this remembering that as soon as the thinking gets overly involved, if the thinking gets too much and starts to become an obscurance or an uncomfortableness, automatically we say, actually, no thinking is really important. Right? The thinking is... Yes, so that's where the fine balance is that we engage in it when it's what we enjoy.
Yeah.
And at any moment we're able to drop out of it, understanding that even if I stop the thinking mid-sentence, it's okay, because what would be lost if I stop the thinking mid-sentence? At worst, an outcome. And when we stop the sentence mid-sentence, the thinking sentence, to drop back into being, what we know is if that outcome is lost, who cares, because I'm connected to myself.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Hello. So I have a question about the ego, identity, and thinking mind. Sometimes we say, like, for example, I need to work on myself. So there is object and subject. Somebody is working on somebody. Is it that the working mind is working on the thinking mind? Or sometimes the thinking mind is working on the thinking mind? Because sometimes we say, I need to get better at that. And like, so there is, I think, kind of lost in that, all these descriptions. And I think yesterday you said, like, ego is just the identity. It's not something that is really separate that we have to destroy, because then how would we function in life if it didn't exist really? So
okay, so I'll start by defining that in this teaching, and this teaching is based on looking at what is practically here and putting descriptions onto what's practically here. It says we are the person. And I acknowledge that the methodology of undoing certain dynamics of the person actually may require a teaching to say you are not the person, right? Because if a teaching says you are not the person, let the thinking of the person be, let the cravings of the person be. You are not that. Remain centered in what you are. Right? To me, they're talking to an aspect of the person. And when we find ourselves witnessing the body functioning, the thinking functioning, we can often follow the descriptions given and think, now I know myself, which is not the person. When we look more closely, we find that actually the witnessing aspect that can get triggered, that can a shift that can happen because we're told we're not the person, which is why I don't have a criticism for a teaching that says you are not the person. I understand it as essentially an input from life bringing about a change. When we look at this shift and we say, hey, I've believed that this shift is something that is not the person witnessing the person. Right? And we believe this because as part of those teachings we're told a lot of things, like it says you can't be the person because if you were the person you wouldn't be able to observe the person. And then we say the teaching says just like the eye can't see the eye. Right? It's not really, those statements don't hold up to critical thought. Right? But luckily seekers at certain points, well, not luckily, we don't have that much critical capacity at some points, and we believe things, and actually it's helpful to believe some things because it brings about shifts, brings about change. But what if it, just like, okay, the eye can't see itself, but the eye can see the leg, and the eye can see the hand, and the hand is the part of the person, right, or part of the body, and the eye is part of the body. So actually, you could say the body can see itself, or at least the body can see part of itself. The eye part of the body can see the hand part of the body. So then if we start bringing in a bit of critical thinking to these things that have a purpose, where they say, you know, if you can witness the body, you're not the body. Say, well, what about if an aspect of the person is able to witness another aspect of the person? And we say, wow, so maybe when witnessing happens, that isn't suddenly the witnessing of God, witnessing the body that I am not. Maybe witnessing is a shift of the person, where the capacity of a person's awareness expands such that the awareness of the person can observe from a different standpoint to what it could before it received those instructions, before it received those inputs. And so I would say that we are the person, even when shifts happen that allow witnessing to happen. That is the person witnessing.
So it's like a split in the mind, let's say, that there is awareness of
the mind itself.
What's happening within, let's say.
Exactly. So, you know, so for me, this teaching is bringing in nuances that haven't been needed before. In fact, if you bring these nuances in before, they can disturb the shifts, because if you become too nuanced about the descriptions, it may not have as powerful an effect on what needs to happen as if we just say something like, you are not the body. Right? But your question was, hey, can you please explain the difference between ego, the difference between thinking mind, the difference between working mind?
More like in these phrases when we see ourselves, that we want to work on some part of ourselves, how, I mean, more than like the descriptions, like who works on what.
Who works on it. So this is why I had to first give a description of what I would say is, from many years of investigating what is actually happening and finding that certain beliefs and certain concepts get question and say, hey, that's not necessarily as true as I might have been told. That's why I have to put that in place in order to answer your question correctly. So what is the ego? The ego in this teaching equates to the person. And we are a person at the point of being conceived. We could say the person starts, we're born, so the person is now in the world. And throughout the process, up to death, we are the person. Ramana, to me, and I sort of, when you come to see it, how can someone see it differently? Although we can completely come to see how impressionable we are, based on new conditioning, that we suddenly see the world through the lens we have. So to me, Ramana was a person who went up into a mountain, stayed in caves, meditated. Change was happening to that person. Change whereby a realization of self happened. Now, what is that self? To me, the self is the core of Ramana, the core of the human being. So we always are the person, and that is what I would say we can call the ego. So the ego doesn't die. The person remains. So what is it that dissolves? What is it that dies? And when in different teachings we hear the word ego, what are they referring to? Because they're not using the word ego in the same way that I've just described it. So in those other teachings, ego equates to what in this teaching is the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. So we can have an ego with the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, and then an ego that has, as a result of life impacting it a certain way, changing it. We have an ego where the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome has fallen away, has been dissolved, has been seen by the mind of the ego to be essentially a belief in the very same mind of the ego. That's why we create the conceptual distinction of the thinking mind and the working mind. So we say the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes exists in what we call the thinking mind. And then when the working mind is, which really is the same one brain, when the working mind is conditioned by life with concepts that allow it to see the functioning of itself. So our brain, especially once this witnessing shift has happened, has the capacity to see itself or to see outputs of itself and assess them. Right? So the shift is actually a changing of the brain structure such that there is a rigidity that was there before has loosened up. And then the mind functioning of the intellect, cognition, whatever we want to call it, can see things that it couldn't see before. So it sees its own functioning from a more objective standpoint. So if we say, I need to work on myself, it could be anything. It could be the thinking mind, thinking that it has control to do whatever work it wants to do, right? Which is the thinking mind not realizing that it can only function according to how life shapes it in each moment. So if the thinking mind says, I have to work on myself, I'm going to make this happen, that's the thinking mind. If a different part of the mind that has realized actually this attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcome is part of the problem. So I understand that work on myself will only happen as part of the unfolding of life, and as life conditions the mind to see things it couldn't see before. Whenever the change happens, it's always because the working mind sees aspects that are not optimal, and those aspects dissolve. One of the methodologies is a methodology that encourages So I say that actually all this talk is really about silence. At the end of the day, the talk is just talking to the working mind, so that the working mind gets equipped in a way that it currently isn't. The way the brain functions, because it's an intelligent, self-organizing intelligence that grows upon itself. Once it gets a base, it will contemplate, which is just a functioning of the brain, and the understanding gets deeper and deeper, and that means the antidote gets more and more powerful. The antidote that starts cutting off the thinking mind, and once it's become a fairly strong antidote, it cuts off the thinking mind quickly, and then it knows shut up, like it knows stop. That the working mind understands that it only has a job to do when a job is needed. So it cuts off and then silence. So even though I'm talking a lot, we're really talking about silence. And so another teaching that encourages us to leave the personhood alone is really encouraging silence as well. Now, the two support each other, because if we only know the working mind and we don't ever appreciate silence, it's a problem. If we only know silence and we keep dropping into silence, certain dynamics that are in place don't get addressed. You know, by dropping into silence, the actual root error doesn't get uprooted. So in the end, we find it's a combination of knowing silence and dropping into silence and appreciating what we really are, which really becomes part of the experiential knowledge of the working mind. Like knowing, what I am, just silence, is enough. Not only is it enough, it is what allows there to be contentment and fullness in the present moment. So dropping into silence becomes part of the information the working mind gathers that allows it to know that its job is really to cut off suffering and then be quiet. So
that working mind can be conditioned as well, or is actually being conditioned.
It is, yeah. To stop as often as it feels good to stop. Stop, because that stopping is the ultimate resting place. It's the goal, in a sense, the silence from the thinking mind.
So did that happen in you, that the working mind start functioning, or maybe not working, the thinking mind, or it's just like the function is different now of the thinking mind?
The thinking mind ceases at some point, because the ground on which, or the ground that we call the thinking mind, gets dissolved. Why does it get dissolved? Let's talk about this. What is the basis of the thinking mind? The basis of the thinking mind is the belief that I am a separate entity in life, not connected to life, essentially, this autonomous, independent, insulated entity, this me controller, and that I require outcomes, pleasure, 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 in order to be complete. They are, when we start investigating, fictions. Let's look at the doership. This is the explanation. You've heard it before, but it doesn't hurt to hear it again. What is the explanation that says I am never disconnected from life, and I am never autonomous and independent? So it says, what is the ego? What is the human being? The human being is a combination of the body, which includes the brain, very complex, interconnected. So when I talk about the brain, it's really not separate from the rest of the body. So we are a biological instrument. But that biological instrument without consciousness is effectively useless. So the human being is a combination of the vehicle and consciousness flowing through that vehicle. Now, let's look at the vehicle, because the vehicle is exactly that, the vehicle. You can't have a person without the vehicle. So the person is the combination of vehicle and consciousness. Now, it's the vehicle that functions. The consciousness just enlivens the vehicle, creates the capacity of awareness and the sense of existence. So the human being, where did it come from? It spawned, it was an extrusion, an expression of a greater life. A life that, let's say, starts off as basic elements. If we go further back, we could say it was nothing. At some point, nothing exploded into everything. And a complexity started to happen. Out of the basic came more complex. So the complex is a result of the basic, and the basic essentially is linked to the nothing. And so as the basic becomes more complex, at some point life comes out of the complex. And a human being, or the human species, becomes the wave of evolution. So humanity is not separate from life, it's a result of the developing complexity of this manifestation. And then when we look at us as a specific human, where did our vehicle come from? The sperm and the egg came together and started to grow because of a biological intelligence, not something that we controlled. And the growing continued to happen. The heart started pumping at a certain time, the brain started, the arms developed. And so what we are here in physical form and mental form is a result of the growing process, which is essentially life. And so we see, I didn't create myself. I am a result of life. So I'm not separate from life ever. I've never, when I was ejected out of the parent, out of the mother, out of the womb, and the cord was cut, right? We might say, oh, that's when I became separate. But we were never separate. We were in a hospital room to start off with, and in the hospital room we were held and spoken to, and let's say we were left alone. That all of that, whether we were spoken to and held or whether we were left alone, we were never isolated from the circumstance. So we developed, we grew according to the genetic structure, which is still functioning automatically. Like we don't do the immune system, we don't do the heart pumping, we don't do the brain thinking. All of that is happening. And all along in life, we're being conditioned by whatever we're exposed to, by the family we were born into, by the religious structure in the area that we grew up in, the political, the friends that we met, the school we went to. And none of that was in our control. We don't know how we're going to be conditioned in the next moment. So here we are in life once again. The body is still being conditioned by life. This talk is just new conditioning. And how it affects us, it's not in my control. I can't control how the new conditioning that's coming out here is going to affect someone. And the person themselves can't control how they're going to be affected. We can only see the result in a particular moment. So then it says that however I function, however I think, however I speak, I'm speaking English now because I was conditioned by life in an English-speaking country. I can't speak Japanese unless life somehow brings in that conditioning. So at each point in time, each moment, I am an instrument designed by life to be one way, the way I am. Everyone is the same. And so we will all function contrary to the thinking mind that says, oh, I could function this way or that way in a particular moment. So the thinking mind says, oh, I should have functioned differently to the way I did. That's a thought process based on a lack of understanding of the actual dynamics that bring about the movement of the human being. When we understand, I'm like a calculator or any instrument. The calculator, when we put in a certain input, 2 plus 2, is forced to output one answer. The calculator can't say 5 when you put in 2 plus 2, unless the calculator is designed to output 5. But calculators, assuming they're designed correctly, you go 2 plus 2, which is the input, has to output 4. It's non-optional. And the human being is essentially a very complex vehicle that receives input in a particular moment and has to, according to its design, put out a specific output. And the machine itself, when it's not programmed to understand life clearly, looks at the output, doesn't understand it as the output of a machine, and the machine itself says, oh, I should have produced a different output. And at a certain point in time, life conditions the machine to realize it's a machine and to see that the output that was put out at every point in life by this machine and by all the other machines was what was destined to be put out. So the machine stops saying, I should have done this differently. You should have done this differently. The machine stops looking at a circumstance and blaming the person for an extended period in horizontal time. It's just no longer programmed to do that. And until life delivers a change in programming, the machine is forced to look at the action of someone that hurt it or delivered pain and hate them, seeing them as a separate, independent entity, not understanding that they actually are a programmed instrument forced to. So what I'm talking about is a change in the programming of the machine that allows acceptance to happen. And what is acceptance? Acceptance is simply the absence of non-acceptance. So acceptance is not something the machine does. What happens is the machine stops producing outputs of non-acceptance, of blame, of shame, of pride, of expectation of how life should look. It stops producing that. And then the experience is, that's peace of mind.
So with all being said, isn't eventually and essentially the end of the quest is knowing who you truly are and realizing that there is no separation or the dissolvement of separation between you and everything else? Is it I mean, it sounds like it's not necessary. It sounds like you say, okay, I'm working on the machine, on the system, on the mind, on the working mind. But what I try to understand from your point of view, is it necessary to have this, how to say, like a...
End of separation.
End of separation and to ground it and to make it like...
It depends
solid.
What separation someone is talking about, because in this understanding, which is the falling away of the misunderstanding essentially, psychological separation falls away. But we have to be very clear on what that separation is. What is the separation that causes the suffering? Because often what we're looking for is an end of separation on the experiential level, right? And when oneness states happen, there is experiential oneness So you could say the end of separation experientially. And those oneness states are very aided, in a sense. They come in when we are exposed to certain teachings that talk about oneness. My explanation of that is that the brain actually is a very impressionable instrument. The way that the brain works is it fills in gaps based on what it has learnt should be in the gaps. So if we understand how the brain produces experience, it produces experience based on what it has learnt should be in the experience. And so we can see this in various optical illusions where certain lines and shadows are put in a certain way, and the brain will see a certain image that when you change something, you realize, wow, that was just a two-dimensional image, and the brain sees it as three-dimensional, for example. So, and neurology will tell us that's because the brain has learnt that when those lines and shadows exist in that, to see depth. Because when it's experienced that it sees those lines, and then the rest of it experience goes and experiences depth, right? So it learns what it should experience based on minimal data, and so what we end up with is a very complex experience that essentially is brain created, a lot of it. So when we hear that life is oneness, my reasoning behind this, because I've been through the phases where the oneness states come in, and at those phases, I was relating to that as truth, as reality, the end of illusion, because I was told that separation, experiential separation, is illusion. The world is one. And then suddenly the oneness experiences, the shifts, the peak experience start happening, and at first we say, wow, it was true. They were telling me I wasn't seeing life as it really is. That was illusion. And that when illusion falls away, we will see reality. And so, of course, when that happens, the intellect says that is reality. Thanks to the only teacher I had in physical form. And someone asked me recently, so this is the answer, do you think you needed to have personal contact with your guru in order for the process to complete itself? And I say yes to that question. I don't say you have to, everyone has to, but in my case, I see that the personal contact with my teacher, where he answered specific queries specifically to me because of my question, my specific question. And when I saw the process that happened as a result of that answering of the question, a lot of it was arguing. I was always arguing with him in my head until I saw what he was pointing at, right? So to me the answer is yes, I needed at a certain point, because until that point, all of the oneness realizations happened without personal contact to a guru, just reading the teachings of gurus that had died. And at that stage, I thought that was the ultimate, because certain teachings will, it's the direct path. So the oneness is becomes ingrained as the ultimate realization. So when I went to see my teacher, Ramesh, which was accidental, so life seems to take us where we need to go. These deep realizations and experientially knowing life as non-separate, where I didn't relate to myself as the body. I experientially knew myself as formless awareness in which everything arose, and that was like that for many years, in very extreme forms and more subtle forms. And there was not much suffering. And so I was convinced that is the movement, and I thought, well, the movement is going to become even more towards absolute experiential oneness. And then Ramesh responded to something I brought up when I went to Mumbai after a particularly deep development, I guess you could say, of this oneness. And I went and I explained this state that had come in, which to me was like the ultimate. It couldn't get any more of oneness than this, and any more of the dissolving of the person and disidentification from the body, witnessing everything from nowhere in particular, knowing oneself as the consciousness in which everything arises, seeing that the whole of what seems to be real, solid, is actually just made of this awareness and not separate from it and witnessed by. So the experience was exactly in line with the teachings, right? And there's no way that at that time I would say that that was influenced by concept. Actually, I said at that time, that's the complete, when all concept falls away, that is what reveals itself. I have to say to everyone on the video how wrong I was. That's not the liberation, that's not the enlightenment. Enlightenment is not a state of oneness. Life is one, right? The nature of life is oneness. But we're not looking for the experience of oneness. The experience of oneness on a continuous basis, especially oneness where all separation falls away, is not what enlightenment so I'm talking from my experience and my teachers and how I interpret the other teachings, even if they say things that are contradictory. When you look in between the lines and see other things, you see actually no one is talking about life as a oneness experience. Going through those phases can be helpful, and it is part of the rigidity of the brain loosening up, where life is able to be perceived from a different perspective. So Ramesh told me when I described this, and I described it because I really felt that, okay, so because it faded, the very intense version faded away, and was left with the more subtle version of seeing everything as one, still being in contact with the consciousness in which everything arises, and knowing myself as that. So when I say it faded away, the experiential knowing of the universe as oneness didn't fade away. Right? It was there for years before this particularly intense experience, and it was there for years afterwards, and it's always accessible. I can, as a human, I can drop into a human functioning, especially when there's nothing to do, where we just drop into a witnessing, and this oneness of experience comes in. Right? But the enlightened state, and we have to define this in this teaching, just the end of suffering, is exactly that, the end of suffering. So I kept describing this to Ramesh. He said, Roger, don't worry about it, that was just an experience. And like in my mind, then it was like, what do you mean it's just an experience? Actually, it was the opposite. It was the end of experience, as I related to the word experience back then. So this was the end of experience, which is said to be experience is illusion. That was reality. And one day it will come back in the very intense version, and that is what enlightenment is. That was my standpoint. And he said, Roger, that was just an experience, don't worry about it. So 3 times I described it because I must have been getting it a little wrong. He wasn't getting what I was describing. And he kept saying, Roger, don't worry about it, that was just an experience. And I sort of left, not satisfied in a sense. Somewhere in the back of my mind I said, well, maybe he doesn't know what I'm describing. Maybe he hasn't had that deep realization. Maybe he doesn't know what enlightenment is. Because what I experienced is what all the great masters in their teachings are suggesting. Once again, how wrong I was, right? He knew more because his process and therefore teaching was actually of beyond that experiential oneness state. And he kept emphasizing in the teaching, what we're really looking for when you go past the concepts and the beliefs that we've picked up, what you're really looking for is just the end of suffering. And so I'd say, yes, in that experience, in that shift, there was no suffering. So that's right, I am looking for the end of suffering, and that end of suffering comes in that experience. Right? I hadn't landed on the fact that, in my experience, the end of suffering was largely there before that experience I was describing. But because the experience was different and profound, it hadn't really dawned on me that what we're looking for is something so simple. And so even when I had something so simple, which was the end of suffering, I was still had an expectation that enlightenment is a oneness experience, or a oneness absence of experience, you could say, depending on what your use of the word experience is. And that's why he kept saying to me, Roger, don't worry about it, that was just an experience. That was just a state. That's not what enlightenment is. What you're looking for is peace of mind. So it didn't register, I just thought, yeah, one day it'll come back pretty soon, because I could see the process was developing that way. And I kept taking the path that I had taken in that morning walk when it had really happened for 15 minutes or so, and waiting for it to happen again. And I saw after about a month there was this sort of craving coming back in, an uncomfortableness with the fact it wasn't there. And because I had become very astute towards what suffering was, it suddenly occurred to me, like, oh, suffering is here in a craving for a state. And then his words hit me. He said, you're not looking for a oneness experience. What you're looking for in practical terms is the end of peace, the end of suffering, peace of mind. And I realized that this expectation that really what I was looking for is this oneness state was now creating suffering which wasn't there in the years before. And now suffering was arising again. And when I saw it and I looked at what the basis of that suffering was, I said, it's based on an expectation of what enlightenment is. An expectation that enlightenment is a oneness experience. Meaning oneness on an experiential level. Meaning the end of separation on an experiential level. And I said, what if he's right? What if that was just an experience and that's not what enlightenment is? And it clicked. I said, actually, I'm just looking for peace of mind. And I've had peace of mind for years, and now my peace of mind is disturbed by this expectation. And the thought was, what if I can have peace of mind without a oneness experience? And it wasn't just a hypothetical. I said, of course you can have peace of mind without a oneness. I have had that. And so in that moment, the expectation, the belief that was in the system that was saying enlightenment is the end of separation on an experiential level fell away. And the strange thing is that the peak experiences that I had been having a lot of in that period of time almost instantly stopped happening. So does that mean that I now went back into illusion? And let's see. Does it mean that now I was back in illusion and reality has slipped away? That's what some people might conclude from listening to this. Oh, you lost it in a sense. And I said, not at all, because my experience went to a whole new level of depth of peace of mind. And it became, from my own experience, I exclaimed, I'm not looking for a oneness experience. In practical terms, what I'm looking for is peace of mind in daily living, which is the absence of suffering, and that peace of mind exists while knowing myself as a person, while knowing myself as an object in a world that is distinct from this object in the world. So my experience is not of oneness experientially, meaning not knowing myself as the tree or the other person. If I come to the experience is I know myself as Roger. Understanding that life itself is one, in that this is not disconnected from the rest of life that has come before. And even if we say, well, actually the rest of life that came before is just conceptual, where is it? So, okay, life now, this night, none of it is actually separate, really. It appears to have distinction. Right? The computer is distinct from the tree. But on another level, we can see the interconnectedness. On many different levels, we can see different forms of interconnectedness. We can understand that our perception creates boundaries that beyond the rudimentary perception don't actually exist. But because life is experienced through the body instrument, those distinctions created by the senses will continue to remain there. And so experientially, I will know myself as a particular entity. Meaning, if we stick this body and that body next, I'd much rather someone sticks a knife in that body instead of this body. Because my feedback in life is that experientially, I am linked to this body. And when someone sticks a knife in the leg of that body, I don't feel it. When someone hammers the stone, I don't feel it, but if they hammer my knee, I feel it. And so we come and we start seeing that there is a continuous experience of being a particular body, experientially separate from the other body. So life experientially continues to be a duality. Experience from the perspective of a specific body. So what is the separation that actually falls away? The separation that falls away is not an experiential separation. One we come to know theoretically, deeply, that theoretically life is all one. On many different levels we can come to understand that theoretically. The theoretical understanding doesn't change the experience itself, which remains an experience of me and the other, of many objects. Some which are pleasurable to this body and some which are painful. The psychological separation that falls away is the separation of seeing myself as a separate, independent entity, not connected to life, and therefore seeing the other as a separate, independent entity. And what has happened there is, psychologically, we've essentially drawn a circle around ourselves, a circle that has somehow cut ourselves out of life and said, I'm not connected to life. I'm a separate, independent entity. Now, because I've seen myself that way, it hasn't actually made me separate from life. It's just a perception of myself that perceives a separation where it doesn't actually exist. And so then I perceive the other as a separate, independent doer, essentially drawn a psychological circle around them and cut themselves out. And we have become, by nature, competitors, rivals, and in the worst case, enemies. Because I see that seeing myself as a separate, independent entity that requires pleasure, pleasure, pleasure in order to be complete, I see the other as a competitor against my happiness. Because in any moment, the other can deliver pain to me. And so this attitude of suspicion and rivalry, competition and anonymity, is always there in the background, ready to fire up if the other delivers pain to me. And so psychologically, that is the separation that creates competition and rivalry and anonymity between me and the other. Because I see myself as a doer that is in control of what happens. I see the other as a doer in control of what's happening. And so therefore I have to see ourselves as competitors in life. If that falls away, I see that I am connected to Source. I am an instrument of Source. I am never separate from Source. And you are also connected to Source, never separate from Source. So essentially we are like fingers on a hand, apparently separate, but intrinsically controlled by not ourself. When I see myself as separate, it's like all of the fingers are seen as separate, and so if one finger bumps into the other, I have to hate that finger for bumping into me. And I hate that entity that I see as separate and independent. Whereas what we come to see is that life is like a big set of dominoes. You know, at the beginning, the first domino was hit, and then that has a follow-on effect to everything that happens, and it's not personal. A good analogy of this is the pool table, where the white ball hits the red ball, and then all the balls are in action. And they're all part of one much bigger movement. The psychological separation is what sees me as one of the balls, independent from life, and sees that I bump into another ball of my own free will and volition, which is not the actuality of things. The movement, my movement, is driven, in this example, by the initial impulse of the cue onto the white ball in a closed environment. And how everything ends up is predetermined by all of the variables in the system. So if simultaneous to the cue hitting the white ball onto the red ball, someone has a computer program that simulates this, and let's say it can simulate it at 10 times actual speed, and so at the same time as the cue hitting the white ball, they press simulate, and poosh, all the balls move, and a pattern ends up. And then we wait for that to happen, and what happens is the pattern matches the simulation answer. So we see that what's happening in life is predetermined. What will happen in life is predetermined. We just can't see from our perspective what is predetermined. But at some point we might realize that if I bump into another, it's not personal. I was forced to bump into them. What's more important, if they bump into me, I understand it's not personal. So now the psychological separation between me and the other has fallen away. And I see we're all brothers and sisters in a universal game of consciousness or manifestation of life, forced to function according to the rules or the cosmic laws, God's will, life's will. So now the hatred and shame, the expectation in the future, the regret of the past, the complaining about the present moment, the base on which that used to arise is not there anymore. So life continues to happen. People will continue to bump into me, push me in places that are beneficial or not so beneficial according to my preferences. I am going to continue to bump into people, and they're going to thank me or punish me. And it's not personal. Just for the sake of the recording, if you don't mind using the...
Just because you manifested an attachment to the experience of oneness, does that necessarily take away that it's an aspect of the ultimate truth? I hear what you're describing. It's almost like I can see the difference between, is there any meaning to this? Because if it's all just kind of like a random thing set in motion and the infinite process of infinite karmas just producing whatever comes next, that could lend the sense that there is no God's will. The only sense of God's will might be that in some convoluted way we're we are going to end up in emptiness. So then you have a problem of definition of what, you thought this was enlightenment, now this is enlightenment. And listening to, I get the sense that maybe the two of them are aspects of enlightenment, and you had to experience that at that time to prepare for that.
Mm-hmm.
And then that would leapfrog to the next thing where you would re-experience oneness over and above your acceptance. And the two would marry each other into something even greater at a future time.
It could be because, as we said earlier, I don't see the process as having an end. And so peace of mind is, if there's no end, from my experience, it is at least a stop along the way. It's a stop along the way that is a very significant stop, because once the peace of mind sets in experientially, we feel that there is no sense of caring, in a sense, if there is anything more that comes after it, because the peace of mind means no resistance with life, no attachment to things improving, in a sense. And yet there's an openness that says, I don't know that this is the end, and so there could be greater levels of enlightenment, you could say.
Yes, a greater embrace of mystery.
Yes. However, I've very much seen that in order to get to the peace of mind, the falling away of certain concepts, certain beliefs, needs to happen.
Yeah, it's like the same thing being re-experienced at a higher octave when something has been removed that apparently seems different, like almost paradoxical, acceptance and oneness. It's like on a certain level they appear paradoxical, and yet as they move together to higher octaves they become, well, actually just different flavors of exactly the same thing.
Or complementary even.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And yes.
So then we never arrive. Oh, wait, no, that's not true. But I mean, we're left with that speechlessness, that silence of never being able to say exactly
what it is.
What it is, or where we are.
Yeah. So you've touched on a couple of important points here. So in this framework, this conceptual framework, we define what enlightenment is according to this framework, which hopefully people can see. It's a definition of essentially a process that never ends. So what does that mean? We're saying, okay, we're defining enlightenment within this teaching as something specific, but not necessarily saying it has an end. And so in this teaching, we're saying enlightenment is the end of suffering. That's the specific definition given to it. And we can come to that station along the path of life, understanding that just because we've defined enlightenment, actually there is no such thing in my mind as enlightenment, unless we create a definition of it. So someone will have a definition, oh no, enlightenment is having special powers, right? That's fair enough for me. Like, okay, so your concept of enlightenment is X, Y, and Z. And I say, okay, so that enlightenment is not something I have been graced with. But the enlightenment as defined in this teaching as the end of suffering is something I know from personal experience is available after life does certain things, after life changes a particular way. And so why is it that in this teaching it's chosen out of the many changes that can happen to focus on this one? And the answer is simple, is that until that happens, there is an uncomfortableness in the human being. And that uncomfortableness creates a seeking, and it creates a sense that life needs to be different. And when this kicks in, when life changes us and there's no suffering, without it being conceptually, when we actually experience it, the experience is, this is all that I've ever been looking for. Yeah? And then, when that's the case, when experientially we find there is nothing more to seek, doesn't mean there's nothing more to come. There's nothing more. I say, so this is a very significant station along the way. In fact, I'd say from my experience, it's the most significant station along the way, because it takes away, or it is the ending of a resistance with life.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. There's so many versions of liberation, awakening, enlightenment. Personally, I wouldn't put enlightenment as that term in this case, but I agree with you that it's absolutely critical and essential. I would call it awakening myself. But even it is very subtle, and what it actually, when you try to define it, what it actually is can very much elude definition. You can have certain levels of apparent acceptance, and then, like, from my own experience, there was a time where it was almost like it accidentally started doing me, and I then discovered that my previous notion of, like, I am in acceptance was completely dissolved in a way that's almost impossible to define. It was almost just waking up and finding, oh, that isn't there. And my whole notion of that I'd been any part of the process was just, it looked silly, So
any part of the process as a separate independent doer, or as the controller of it, right?
Yeah, almost like, as you said, the ground was just kind of cracked and broken somewhere along the line. I didn't even notice that bit. I didn't even notice how that happened, It's almost like I'd invited the process to begin, and then the process finally took its own logic without my doing, in a sense. Yeah. And yet, there were, at the same time, there's still vestiges of personhood, as you described, that is just perfectly intact, and it's almost mysteriously.
But they don't.
You wouldn't want to go in and define it too rigorously.
But they don't. Those vestiges of personhood don't create any problem. They're not. Well, at least the ones I'm talking about are what I would call biological and not psychological. And so, Roger has preferences. Everyone, I would say, continues to have preference. The attachment to the preference being delivered falls away, but the preference itself stays. So the preference isn't in itself problematic to our peace of mind. Our attachment to the preference being delivered is. So if that falls away, we see that the problematic aspect of the person has fallen away, but the individuality remains, and it doesn't cause a problem. In fact, I say, wow, what a blessing that the individuality remains without the aspect of the individual that used to disturb living life.
Right, which brings that sense of, like, it always was this way. It's just quite natural to be a human being, so to speak, and thank God, because this is where we appear to be. But I mean, to me, it's always like the fan keeps turning. There may be problems. I mean, I wouldn't pretend that I never have any problems of any kind, but they just don't they don't stick real hard. I just can't. It's just, it functions differently in a strange kind of mixed up way, like a kind of a natural process of integration. Then just kind of seems to unfold.
Yes. So I hear what you're saying, and I know you're speaking from experience. Exactly what the nuances of your experience are, we can't tell from a talk. But so Ramesh used to say, enlightenment is not a certifiable event. Right. No one can certify that you're enlightened. But he gave, and I will give, because it's the definition here, a way that we can certify it for ourselves. And certifying it for yourself doesn't do anything other than confirm and allow the seeking to stop even more if it hasn't completely stopped. And he said, it's very simple. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. If suffering has ended on a continuous, unbroken basis, meaning it doesn't arise at all, then according to the definition of this teaching, you're enlightened. And he said, going out and telling people serves no purpose, because actually that enlightenment delivers the result. It's an internal result, which is your own freedom from suffering. And if we feel like we're going out needing to tell people, then that's probably part of the attachment to outcome that hasn't dissolved, and it will feel uncomfortable, which means suffering hasn't really ended. So to the extent that we see that we can confirm it for ourselves, and the only purpose of confirming it for ourselves is to deepen the realization that it's got nothing to do with the pleasures we receive from out there. So it's not about telling the world in order to receive gratification.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
It's almost like an expression to oneself, which I think is also, in the teaching, is almost like you, because in a way you're moving further away from the logic of the world that apparently surrounds you. So there is a certain amount of self, on certain levels of yourself, a self-validation that's an entirely internal process.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
By the comprehension, it's different levels of yourself have to get it, so that the suffering of disconnect between you and what surrounds you dissolves completely. That's how it seems to me.
Yes, which to me in the description is the attachment to outcomes being a particular way. So I find, this is my sort of define, is that we can describe this efficiently once the working mind really hones in on what has changed, what specifically the change is. Refining for ourselves, which to me is part of the integrating and part of the deepening of the process. Maybe that even happens after peace of mind, where we really find, so if someone says to me, we can't talk about this, I say, we can. Someone says, well, you can talk about it, but it's not going to come close to the thing itself. What we can do is become very clear on a lot of the specific dynamics and describe them accurately, which isn't ever going to be the piece itself, but there can be a relevance to describing it to the extent that it assists the working mind. So I'm happy with the fact it's a mystery. Really, we're not going to know, but then we can describe what in practical terms changes without holding that description absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.